again, a little bit bucking the mainstream. The mainstream in psychology at the time was still, in order to think clearly, you had to put your emotions aside, that your emotions couldn't be helpful. They couldn't be adaptive.
They would impede intelligence rather than actually be a component of it.
And, if we go back to Darwin, he didn't have that view. He thought animals had emotions in order to motivate behaviors that would help them survive.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. I'm Nick Dirks. I'm the president of the New York Academy of Sciences. And for this episode, we're joined by Peter Salovey to discuss emotional intelligence, public trust in science, and the future of higher education. Peter Salovey is a pioneering social psychologist, and he served as the 23rd president of Yale University from 2013 to 2024. He's widely known for co-developing the theory of emotional intelligence, a concept that has transformed the fields of education, business, leadership, and mental health. As a scholar, educator, and institutional leader, Salovey has championed access to higher education, scientific innovation, and the integration of research across disciplines to address global challenges. He is also chair of the New York Academy's Board of Governors. Peter, great to have you with us today.
A pleasure to be with you, Nick. Thank you for inviting me.
So, Peter, let's go back to the days when you were a simple social psychologist before you became dean of the college at Yale and provost and president. And you were trained as a social psychologist, studied at Stanford and at Yale, but at some point came out with a paper on emotional intelligence around 1990, if I remember, that revolutionized the field of psychology and our understanding of ourselves as humans interacting with each other in registers that have to do with emotions. So the first question I have is, emotional intelligence is now a household term. So how was it that it wasn't, or at least wasn't part of the lexicon of social psychological, toolkits in the 80s when you were obviously beginning to work on this? How did you identify it, and then how did you come to as it were, discover it as a provable fact of our human social life?
Well, thank you again for inviting me and for the questions on emotional intelligence. We had no idea, and when we published that paper in 1990, that we were on to anything that would be of interest to anybody else. Really? It's kind of amazes me now. What are we, 30 some odd years later, that it is still something that resonates with the culture. So back in the late 80s, I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Yale, and I have a collaborator, Jack Mayer. He, at the time, was at SUNY Purchase and later moved on to University of New Hampshire. He and I are friends and talking. We both have an interest in human mood and human emotion at a time when the field was very cognitive. There weren't that many people studying emotion. The idea of an affective science, which is the term used now, I think was not at all in the professional.
Really, there was just really no real attention.
Very little. People were studying, processes in social cognition, how you thought about other people, how those thoughts impacted your behavior, the way you thought about yourself and such. It was a very cognitive field. But there were some people working on emotion, and Jack and I worked on emotion. We were inducing moods in the laboratory and looking at how they affected what you paid attention to, what you remembered, how you remembered it, and even a little bit into social behavior, how it affected your willingness to help another person, for example, how these moods affected that tendency. We're working away on these kinds of projects, and one of the things that struck me was that there were areas in the science of emotion that seemed related to each other, and yet the investigators didn't even know each other. So if you studied the language of emotion, that was one kind of research. If you studied the regulation of emotion, how you manage your emotions, that was another kind of research. If you studied the impact of emotion on decision making and problem solving and creativity, that was another set of researchers. And the idea of emotional intelligence first came to us as, well, we could organize the field around different, essentially, skills involved in the processing of emotional information. And Jack had actually a little bit of a background, serious background in intelligence research, having studied with a man named Doug Detterman, who was an intelligence researcher.
And just, give me a sentence or two about what intelligence research meant at the time. Was it about IQ
Yeah,
and things like that?
it was still about IQ, but also what was in the air very much from researchers like Bob Sternberg and Howard Gardner was the idea that what we measured as intelligence, that is IQ, and the old saw was that, intelligence is defined as the thing that IQ tests measure.
Mm-hmm.
If you could measure it, it was an intelligence. If you couldn't measure it, it wasn't an intelligence. That was pretty narrow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was really kind of analytic reasoning and problem solving with a heavy dose of verbal intelligence, just how facile you were with language. But Garner and Sternberg, they were saying it's broader than that. What about creativity? What about street smarts? And one of the things they were saying is, what about, particularly Gardner, what about an intelligence about what's happening in your own body, about your feeling states? That's starting to sound like emotional intelligence, or what could be an emotional intelligence. And he I think, called it introceptive intelligence or personal intelligence. Anyway, that Jack having that background in intelligence and both of us working on emotion and getting interested in organizing the field, we're at a conference and we sat down and started sketching out a paper, and it became that 1990 paper. We called it emotional intelligence. I think Jack was the first one to utter that phrase while we were brainstorming, and he was helping me paint my house, actually. And we submitted that paper laying out a kind of framework for the skills involved in processing emotion information, and why emotion relevant information were data, represented data, would be helpful to you, would be adaptive. Again, a little bit bucking the mainstream. The mainstream in psychology at the time was still, in order to think clearly, you had to put your emotions aside, that your emotions couldn't be helpful, they couldn't be adaptive.
They would impede intelligence rather than actually be a component of it.
And, if we go back to Darwin, he didn't have that view. He thought animals had emotions in order to motivate behaviors that would help them survive. He thought animals would have emotions that would have facial expressions associated with them that would communicate something to other animals, right? I bare my teeth when I'm angry, a signal to you to back off, right? Give me some space. Don't block my goal, right? Anyway, we had this view. We wrote this paper. We sent it to several top journals in our field, and it was rejected by all of them. And
familiar story.
Almost made us give up. And we asked a colleague in the psychology department at Yale, Jerry Singer, to read the paper. And he liked it and gave us some feedback. And he said you should really keep pushing, and that he edited a small journal called Imagination, Cognition, and Personality. And that it would have to be peer-reviewed and such, but if we'd like to submit it to his journal, he would get it peer-reviewed in the usual way. And maybe it would fare better because he liked the paper and was pretty open-minded as an editor. It ended up being accepted in that journal. And in fact, in the first several years that the paper was out, not a single person cited it. It just died. Well, it's now been cited, I don't know, tens of thousands of times. It's the most cited paper that Jack and I have ever written, and it's the most cited paper that journal has ever published. And how did that happen? And I was at a conference a few years after the paper had come out, and at that conference I met a man named Dan Goleman.
Well, I was going to ask you about Dan Goleman.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so Dan is a PhD in psychology and from Harvard, but was really known as a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time wrote the column on behavioral science for the New York Times. And I think that's where he was best known. On Tuesdays in the Science Times, there'd often be a Dan Goleman column on human behavior. And he was working on a book. And the book at the time was about, he was tentatively calling it emotional literacy. And it was about the idea that emotions might play a role in education. And that if teachers could learn to manage the emotions and deal with the emotions of school children, kids would learn more, would like school more, would make more friends in school, be less likely to drop out, get the angle. And I said, Dan, I've got a framework that organizes emotion skills that teachers might pay attention to. And he said, oh, I'd love to read the paper. And I gave him that 1990 paper. And Dan came back to me and said, I love this paper. I love your term emotional intelligence. I want to retitle the book Emotional Intelligence. And I want to use, he said, I'll have to make the framework simpler for a more general audience. He was writing, a general popular science book, not a professional book. And he said, but, are you okay with that? And I said, of course I'm okay with that. Nobody is citing this paper. Nobody's even reading this paper. Maybe it will generate some interest. I said, could you do me a favor, though? Can you cite our paper in your book?
Yeah.
He did more than that. Of course, he cited our paper. And in the introduction, he said, I first heard this phrase from Peter.
But I will tell you that, I've talked to a number of friends and who, will ask me about the New York Academy. And I talk about the fact that we have this great board of governors and a new chair who is the social psychologist who coined the term emotional intelligence. And I've been on more than one occasion challenged by somebody saying, well, I thought that was Dan Goleman who did emotional intelligence.
What Dan Goleman did is publish this book, now called Emotional Intelligence, in 1995. And we had written a few other papers between 1990 and 1995. And the thing I hadn't realized is that Dan didn't just write a book, he wrote a bestseller.
Yes.
And this book ended up, I think it rose as high as number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list.
Is that right? I didn't realize
it
was
there for more than a year.
No kidding. So that really did popularize the idea.
And I don't know.
And then he did TED Talks too, right?
So with the precursors to TED Talks, the book was translated into dozens of languages, became a bestseller all over the world. And I don't know if it was Dan or his publisher or just the way things work, but magazines like Time magazine and the equivalent in Germany and Spain and Japan all did cover stories on emotional intelligence. And soon Dilbert is talking about emotional intelligence in comics. And Roz Chast does a New Yorker cartoon on emotional intelligence. And most of this, to be honest, is being motivated by Dan's book on the bestseller list.
Sure.
But every one of these articles refers to our original paper.
That's what I was going to ask.
Often has a little photograph of us, and where did this idea come from? And while to be a little crass about it, Dan did a much better job of monetizing emotional intelligence than we did. What do we know? But I have to say, Dan's book made us famous.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to be honest about it.
Right.
So I'm very interested how an idea with a few publications becomes a best-selling book, in this case written by someone else. At that time, mostly academic academics didn't write for the general public. That has really changed in my field.
Well,
But
in
at the
those
time,
days,
and
it could
as
be held against you
I
as
would
an
say, as an
academic.
untenured faculty member, I don't know that it was an option in
Yeah,
those days.
that's right.
In those days, it is different now, and I think for the better, actually. After the book came out, we had to get serious about the idea in a much greater, more productive sense, and in particular, when the book came out, everybody wanted to measure it. And so all the measuring instruments were things like the USA Today questionnaire on emotional intelligence, right? It wasn't serious science. These were not reliable tests. They were not validated tests. There's a whole field called psychometrics in which you develop a test or a measure of a psychological phenomenon. And it's hard to do if you're going to do it right. But you have to show that you get the same score now as you would a month from now. That's reliability, a kind of reliability.
Well, it had to be in some way a kind of parallel to the IQ.
To the IQ test. And
yeah.
we very much felt that self-report measures, which are what they're called, asking people, do you think you're pretty good at identifying the facial expressions of other people? Do you think you have a sophisticated emotional vocabulary? Are you good at managing? We think people don't get very good feedback on those things. And in fact, the correlation between answering questions like that and an ability-based test modeled on the IQ test, and there's much that's wrong about IQ testing, but ability testing is the gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
And the correlation between it and self-report, it's pretty low.
I would imagine so, yeah.
In fact, correlations can go from 0, no correlation, to 1, a perfect correlation, or 0 to -1, a perfect inverse correlation. And the correlation that we got between our measure and a self-report measure is about 0.17. That's really pretty low. That's really pretty low.
So as you, as it were, take advantage of the popularity, the growing popularity of emotional intelligence as an idea, do you feel like you now almost have an obligation to find a way in which you can say, look, this really is something that should be put next to an intelligence quotient,
exactly
to intellectual intelligence, or whatever you would say? I
think in the 1990 paper, the original paper, we wrote something like, emotional intelligence. It's not something like an EQ that you would actually measure with a test. Well, in fact, it was an EQ, and it needed to be measured with a test. And so we developed a test called the Mesquite, which is Mayer, Salovey.
I thought that was a barbecue.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, Mayer, Salovey, Caruso emotional intelligence test. The funny thing about the name is that the first translation of that test was in Japanese, where it was called the mosquito. So you go from mesquite wood, and I always thought the publisher of the test should have advertised it with a phrase like, I got grilled with the mesquite. but they thought that was, they thought we should remain psychologists and they'd take care of marketing. Or I got bitten by the mosquito in Japan. Anyway, the mesquite, which now is in its second version, just came out, called the Mesquite 2, published by a company called Multi Health Systems, which develops tests and measures for psychologists, for people who work in personnel, HR in companies, and for clinicians. And you have to get trained to use these tests, and there's a scoring system. But we had to do the research. We did the research showing that it was reliable and that it predicted something important. And that's where we really got busy. What's the point in developing a test that measures something accurately that isn't important, that doesn't matter?
So I want to ask you a little bit more about that. In the first instance, I can see that somebody like Dan would be interested in the idea of emotional intelligence because, of course, the principal predictor of success was often seen to be, prior to the 90s, your IQ. And of course, for children in school, intelligence, every teacher would tell you, it's important. But I would imagine that my mother was a teacher, and she was teaching in New Haven, Connecticut, in fact, at Wilbur Cross and Hill House High School. You know both. But she would come back to tell us, after long days in the classroom, that it was, not a very good predictor of actual success. That is to say, she would be given some set of test results, and the kids who were the ones at the top of the class were ones who weren't necessarily at the top of the intelligence scale.
Yeah, no. So part of the issue is in most environments, the range of IQ is quite restricted. So when people will say something like, in my workplace, EQ matters much more than IQ. Well, they're right about that.
Mm-hmm.
And they're right about that because everybody in that workplace is
right. So you have a certain
at least
threshold.
A little bit above average to well above average. If you had a workplace where people ranged from as low as you can score on an IQ test to as high as you can score on an IQ test, I promise you, IQ is going to make a huge, huge difference.
Yeah, if you just take the total population.
Just taking total. But even in Wilbur Cross High School, where your mother taught, the IQ is not a very good predictor of your ability to relate to other people, your motivation for learning, your ability to collaborate with another person or sit quietly and listen. There's so many other motivations to enjoy learning, to use what you learn in a productive way.
So, as I look at your career, Peter, and I see what you went on to do after this, I have to say that my own experience of leadership in a university setting is one in which you obviously have to be at the top of your own scholarly field. You won't have the respect of your colleagues if you aren't. But to go on to become dean and provost and president, you need a little bit of this EQ. I'm sure you've thought a lot about, how EQ figures into leadership. And before we get to your own career, could you say a little bit more about the role it plays, as you understand it, as a psychologist, in understanding what kinds of people do, in fact, succeed most and best in leadership kinds of roles, with EQ and IQ as two factors in the background?
Sure. So emotional intelligence has 4 basic skills. One is the ability to identify emotions in yourself and in other people. The second is the ability to understand how emotions progress in time. The third is the ability to manage your emotions and the emotions of other people. And the fourth is the ability to put this all to use in thinking, problem solving, being creative, and the like. And, in leadership, those skills are going to really help you. Now, you don't get to there are no university presidents with below average IQ.
Yeah.
Despite what the faculty might think at some places. They're just aren't.
Despite what they've said on
Right?
occasion, yes, indeed.
Everybody's going to be above average or well above average.
Yeah.
Right? And so what's going to determine whether you're successful or not is not if you're smart enough for the job. Everybody who has these jobs is smart enough for the job. But can you listen to people with empathy? Can you work as part of a team when you need to work as part of a team? Can you lead others in a charismatic way when that needs to happen? Do people want to listen to you? Can you manage other people's feelings in a crisis?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Can you manage people's feelings when it's time to celebrate? Can you manage your own feelings? For crying out loud, it's a stressful job,
Right.
as you well know, and as I experienced for 11 years. There's something going on all the time. There's a lot of constituencies that need to be on board. Can you create alignment in the organization where we're all going to agree, here's what we're going to work on. All of that requires emotion-based skills, the ability to harness the data that your emotions are providing you and use it in some way. So all of our experiments and studies always is too strong. Generally, we would measure IQ. We would measure aspects of personality. There's kind of 5 key dimensions of personality. They're often called the big 5. The one that people know the most commonly is introversion, being an introvert versus being an extrovert. So we would measure that and other aspects of personality, and then we would measure emotional intelligence with the mesquite. And what you want to show is that the outcome that you're interested in, leadership emergence in an organization, or behaving in a pro-social way, helping other people, or if you're a kid, avoiding delinquency or drugs or getting into fights, is predicted by emotional intelligence over and above IQ, over and above those basic dimensions of personality. That's the kind of game plan for the science in the area.
So let's go into leadership and some of the challenges that you confronted. And of course, you can't be president of a university these days without confronting challenges.
We all have our share.
You stepped down at a time when the job seemed to become even more challenging than ever before, and it continues to be that way. But going back to before the pandemic, you had a number of issues you had to confront and deal with, and one of them, of course, had to do with the naming of one of Yale's colleges, Calhoun College. And I know that you went through a process. And we'd love to hear a little bit more from you now about thinking back on that experience. First of all, what were the kinds of things that you went through when you had to respond to multiple constituencies that were often completely on different sides of this issue, and adjudicate, nevertheless using, a set of processes that you felt were accountable, responsible, ultimately moral, ethical, but also attuned with, the ethos of an institution that has, a governing board. It has a lot of people who know what it should do, of course, and know what you should do. But you have to live with the decision in a way that no one else does. So I wonder if you could go back and talk about that, but also perhaps talk about, how your evolving notions of leadership helped you during that process.
Sure. Yeah, it's a long story, and I'll try to tell a short version of it. But and I'm writing about it right now, and many lessons to be learned from a leadership point of view, and many places where emotion played a role. So let's start with a little background. Who's John C. Calhoun? Well, he was a U.S. Senator, and he was from South Carolina, and he was Vice President of the United States. And I think scholars all agree no one at the time he was in Congress was a more ardent defender of slavery before the Civil War than John C. Calhoun. He defended it not as, well, this is just a way of life in the South, or this is how we get work done in the South, but rather as the appropriate roles for white and black people. So he essentially defended slavery, and he called it a positive good, as a positive good.
But as part of the natural order.
As part of a natural order of white supremacy, involving white supremacy. And that's how he defended. So fast forward, it's the late 1920s, early 1930s. Yale is building new colleges and naming them. And when you read the notes from that decision made by the trustees of Yale to name a college for John C. Calhoun, well, the only president Yale had was President Taft, but that had just happened. I think it was too recent, and I think they felt that they felt it was just a little uncomfortable to name it after Taft. And I think the only vice president we had at the time was John C. Calhoun.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's subtle. And David Blight has begun to write about some of these things. He's a historian of the Civil War period, 19th century America, but wrote a wonderful book on the legacy of slavery at Yale. And every university that existed before the Civil War has some legacy of slavery to think about and grapple with. And there was some interest, I think, in being more accommodating to Southern youth who were coming north to go to college and worrying about other places like Princeton where they
Well, I was going to say,
go.
I mean, it tended to be the case in the Ivy League that Princeton was the catchment for Southern.
And I think there was some competitive interest, and we should get some of those kids to Yale also, and that it was a signal of sorts, a signal like a war memorial on campus that has the names of both Confederate and Union soldiers who were alumni on it. A tradition at graduation of planting ivy, originally from Ulysses S. Grant's grave and Robert E. Lee's grave, and letting them grow together. Like, I don't know, is it Tristan and Isolde where the ivy grows together?
Where the ivy grows together.
Yeah. But all of these signals.
Yeah.
And
so that was part of the ivy.
It was part of the tradition of the place, and that kind of reconciliation, that new look of at the Civil War. Anyway, so that's all happening at the time. We end up with a college named for John C. Calhoun. Well, there had been protest about that going on and on for many years, long before I was president.
But back to the civil rights days of the 1960s in particular, I would imagine,
movement, and I thought, and here's leadership lesson number one. I thought, well, what if we use it as a template for a conversation on campus? Yes, about race, and those are not easy conversations, I knew that, but also about two really compelling views that are in competition with each other, but both compelling. One view would be that it's really important not to efface the history of the institution. A college was named for John C. Calhoun for a reason. We may think those reasons are appalling now, but we're only going to talk about them as appalling if we're reminded of them. And another equally compelling argument that said basically, why are we honoring John C. Calhoun, this defender of slavery? Why are we making students who play for the Calhoun College intramural flag football team have to wear John C. Calhoun's name on their T-shirts while they play intramural sports? And I'll be honest, I didn't know which way I came down. Another kind of so 2 leadership lessons already. The first one was the idea of having a campus conversation. I gave a speech at the beginning of that year. We're going to have a campus conversation. Was a bit naive, right?
You thought you could control
we could train, for example, the residential college heads as facilitators of that conversation, that we could keep control of that conversation, and come out with a kind of institutional point of view, or at least will have aired both sides of it. It would inform decision making. I think that turned out to be a little bit of a fantasy on my part. And,
well, the truth is that, just speaking as a historian, it was about that time, exactly, in fact.
Yeah, this was fall of 2015.
Yeah, that increasingly the idea of history began to be something that one would clean up and decolonize or, destigmatize by changing names and by trying to, basically condemn and, to some extent, erase
Yeah.
the parts of the past that one didn't like,
That
of which
people
there are
didn't
many.
like.
Yeah.
Of course, there's a
So,
long history of doing that. The Romans used to change the names of buildings and things, and they had a way of doing it where you could, if you looked hard, you might be able to see the old name, but you definitely saw the new name. Uh,
yeah, no,
what
no,
is the word? Palimpsest? Is that
palimpsest.
palimpsest? Yeah, I think in art, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of idea. So it's not a completely new idea, but one was I think it was naive to think that we could have a controlled conversation about that. I wish we could. I wish we could today. I wish, we need to be able to engage really difficult issues, particularly in this polarized time. It's
But
a
this
huge
also
issue.
was a time when there was growing contention on campuses around symbolic issues, and politics
Yeah, we were on
became
the bleeding edge, I think, of a lot
conducted
of
by
that.
that. And of course, you
Right.
also had a few other controversies at the time that
Yes. Well,
involved race and so on
so
and so
what
forth.
happened is I give that speech, I call for this dialogue. People are starting to take it seriously. The college heads begin to pull together students to have this conversation. And then other controversies start to happen. Controversies about Halloween costumes, about what could be said and what can't be said.
That was the very same fall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And suddenly, very hard to contain all of it. The other leadership lesson, another leadership lesson. My predecessor, Rick Levin, who was 20-year president of Yale and a very successful one, what he said, and I was a dean for him and a provost for him, one of his truisms was no jump balls, meaning in the way an economist, he was an economist, would think about where you want to be at the end of all of this and organize the process around getting there, not in a manipulative way, but use that kind of backward induction.
Well, you don't throw the ball up in the air.
And that was his rule, no jump balls.
With the idea that it could go either way.
Jump balls, right?
Yeah,
it can't go either way.
You throw the die ahead of time and you know which way.
I was sufficiently ambivalent to how I wanted this to come out, that the idea of a campus conversation helping me to make the decision was very appealing. That was a mistake. I'll tell you, though, to forward to the to the end game, where I think we made a very good leadership decision. And that was to separate the issues of principle from the issues of application of those principles. And so there was a very meandering way in which we got there. But in the end, finding a faculty member who was a wonderful historian, American historian, and a law professor and lawyer named John Witt to chair a committee.
He used to be at Columbia.
He was at Columbia. And to chair a committee with some students on it, with some alumni on it, and we deliberately populated it with conservative and liberal alumni, with students who have all points of view. My favorite student was a student from Charleston, South Carolina, who was on that committee. Put her on that committee because she wrote me a really compelling letter about playing out the issues the summer before around John C. Calhoun. And to make a long story short, the Witt Committee developed what we now call the Witt Principles. And they didn't decide the Calhoun question. They decided the principles around which you might decide to rename or not rename a historically named building. And principle number one, there were several, but principle number one was, what is the individual's primary legacy? So an individual could have been a racist, or could have been a nativist, or could have been nativist meaning kind of hostile to people from other parts of the world than the U.S., or could have had any kind of point of view politically. If we had ended up in a place where we only named buildings for people we agree with politically, that would have been a bad outcome. But what Witt said is, what is their primary legacy? Is their primary legacy something that we find abhorrent today? Is it something that people even found abhorrent in their own time?
Mm-hmm.
And I think John C. Calhoun passes that test.
Mm-hmm.
He had many people.
Or rather, didn't pass the test.
Didn't pass the test, right? Many people in his day felt, even who were pro-slavery, felt that Calhoun overstated the case. And certainly today, we know about John C. Calhoun because of his legacy of being the strongest elected defender of slavery.
So, I followed this, of course, and was impressed by the ways in which you had to deliberate, and did so by bringing people in and trying to find the principles that you could use to make a decision.
And
of course,
another smart group of people to apply those principles.
And it was I know it was a long, drawn-out process, and I know there were people who felt that there was a bait and switch and so on and so forth.
No,
but
I originally said we're going to keep the name, and realized afterwards that. And why did I think we should keep the name? Because the people I reached out to, including people on the left, were saying to me, one very prominent professor of African American history, saying to me, I lived in Calhoun College when I was an undergraduate. And, I woke up every morning and I thought about John C. Calhoun. And in my mind, I gave him the finger.
Mm-hmm.
And it motivated me to achieve.
Oh, really?
And, and had a very complicated viewpoint as a result. Do you change it? Do you not change it?
Mm-hmm.
I talked to the head of the NAACP, who told me a lot about the process they were using to decide whether to put plaques up where there had been a lynching. And the African American community was really split on, do you identify these places because it's important to remember? Or do you not do that because it's a terrible legacy and we don't want to bring attention to lynching? So I'm listening to all this and taking this all in. And taking in the fact that our faculty didn't really have strong feelings, and our students were split, and our alumni were split, and thought, well, maybe it made sense to contextualize the name, to educate around the name, but not to efface the name. As soon as I announce it, all hell breaks loose.
Right.
And I realized within 48 hours, this isn't going to work.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not going to work. I think as a leader, nobody likes leaders who waffle. And I knew people were going to say, oh, you're just waffling. But I also knew it just wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
And, maybe I thought I had my ear to the ground. I do have reasonable emotional intelligence, and I listen well, I think. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. But those were not the voices who spoke up before we made that decision. So I realized we had to go in another direction. I realized that principals and I talked it over with board members. They had the same idea that we needed to establish principles. We needed to apply those principles, and and use that process.
Yeah. So sometimes leadership is about saying,
I was wrong.
I was wrong. We'll change the plan, and we'll do it differently going forward.
I think you have to.
And to acknowledge that, because this notion that you just stick to what you think is clearly not always either practical or.
I think if every major decision you had to do, you made had to be rethought, there'd be a problem. But I think it's a sign of leadership to admit every once in a while that. This was an error, or I very much felt times were changing as we rolled this out. That this was the right decision for 6 months ago, but it wasn't the right decision for 6 months later. Right? I don't think you have to be aware.
So, Peter, our time is coming quickly to a close, but in the last minute or so, I just wanted to shift. We are delighted, of course, that your leadership is now with us at the Academy as incoming as now chair of the Board of Governors. And I wondered if in the last minute you could say something about the mission of the Academy and how scientific leaders need to respond to the current moment, since
Yes.
we're obviously at a time when science is under major attack.
Yes. So first of all, it's a great honor to be able to chair the Board of Governors of the New York Academy of Sciences and to work directly with you, Nick. It's such a worthy organization. And in this moment, what New York Academy of Sciences can do, particularly given that education has always been such a strong piece of what it did, is to help the public understand scientific thinking, data, scientific outcomes, and to help scientists communicate all of that much better. Because at the end of the day, we need to increase our country's trust in science. Right now, without being overly political about it, there is a kind of populist distrust of expertise, of data, of university research, of medical breakthroughs and medical recommendations. And the answer to that is not blind trust. The answer to that is an educated public that can evaluate for themselves, but have the tools to evaluate for themselves, not just a gut instinct, right? But to have the tools to evaluate for themselves scientific findings and the ability to listen to expertise and understand it. And that doesn't mean everybody has to be an expert on everything. But we have to help, the Academy has to help the typical citizen understand how to differentiate meaningful, high-quality information coming through the channels of social networks and the like, from just somebody's rambling and uninformed thoughts. And that has gotten significantly more difficult. And I am delighted to be a part of helping to develop those skills in the American public by working with the New York Academy of Sciences.
Well, we're delighted to have your leadership now applied to what is a very challenging time for science and indeed for institutions where science is conducted. So we have a lot of work to do, and I'm looking forward to working with you. But thank you, Peter, indeed, for joining us on our Shaping Science podcast today. This wraps up our episode of the Shaping Science podcast.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Great to have you with us. To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences. Shaping Science is made possible with the generous support of Tata Sons.